Thanks for downloading the pod. My guest today is an old friend of the podcast, a cognitive Marine, a serving United States Marine Corps officer just posted at Okinawa. On this episode, we discuss Op Iceberg, the US invasion of Okinawa in the Pacific War and its legacy in the Corps, the US tilt to the Indo-Pacific region and what we can learn from past battles in Singapore and Menorca, modern-day foraging in order to reduce the operational logistic burden, what we can learn from the war in Ukraine, the ongoing war in Israel, his Cognitive Marine Instagram account, how that's been going lately and his plans for the future, legendary United States Marine Corps intelligence officer Pete Ellis, who had the foresight to draft a plan that helped defeat the Japanese in World War II, and then we finish off with his current reading on Desert Island Dits. With some real comms issues on this one, and the sound quality is not as good as normal, but hopefully it won't detract from your listening of a very interesting episode. So don't forget to like, follow, share on social media, and please leave a good review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. If you like what you're hearing, then you can buy me a coffee via the link in the show notes, and this helps cover ongoing costs like site hosting. Let's crack on. Thanks for coming on the podcast. It's been since February, I think, since we last recorded one. So what have you been up to since then?
Yeah, so Colin, it's obviously great to be on your podcast, and I appreciate you having me back. So I've moved all the way from Newport, Rhode Island, out to Okinawa, Japan, and I'm stationing amongst tens of thousands of Marines out here in the First Island Chain, as we like to call it. And I'm assigned to one of the premier Marine infantry fighting organizations we have in the Marine Corps out here in Okinawa, Japan. And I'm the head of logistics for this one of these great organizations. And the reality is my responsibility is kind of twofold. One is to serve my general and everything he needs. And the second thing is kind of serve as the senior logistics advisor for the entire division.
I've been reading a lot about the war in the Pacific recently, especially about the invasion of Okinawa. It was the largest amphibious operation in World War II, fought by the US Marine Corps and the Army. And there was 3 US Marine Corps divisions and 4 Army divisions. And it was a tough fight over 3 months, with 12,500 killed and 36,000 wounded. On the Japanese side, there was over 77,000 Japanese Army killed, 30,000 Okinawan conscripts, and large amounts of civilian population. People don't know the exact numbers, estimates 30 to 150,000. So is it still an iconic battle that's studied today?
Absolutely. Also known as Operation Iceberg, or the Battle of Okinawa, really was a multi-service endeavor. You've got the Navy, you've got the Marines, you've got the Army, you've got the Coast Guard, all kind of fighting the Imperial Japanese. And what's unique about the lessons from Okinawa, what we've learned about Okinawa, is the island hopping campaign that the Marines embarked on just got progressively harder and harder and harder as you got closer to Japan. The enemy was more entrenched as you encroached upon and attacked Japanese positions. And once we got to Okinawa, it really is it was just a whole different ball game here. The reality is that the fight for Okinawa and Operation Iceberg was so brutal to the Marine Corps that it not only changed the character of the Marine Corps in many ways, but it really, the casualty tolls that we experienced from the Battle of Okinawa set the national commanding authority, the leadership of this of the United States during World War II on a kind of separate path to, okay, this cannot be business as usual no longer. We have an enemy that will not give up and will not give in. So those two factors means that every square inch of land will be fought over. And here in Okinawa, I mean, there's infamous moments where you have the suicide cliffs where locals in fear, wrongly told that the Americans are going to do them harm to the innocent civilians that they surrendered to them. These civilians chose to jump off what is known as suicide cliffs. You have all these kind of Hacksaw Ridge that's been made famous by the movie, Medal of Honor recipients, and really just a unbelievable fight for Okinawa. But yeah, been an unbelievable lesson for the Marine Corps. And something we've talked about before is that the Purple Hearts that are being issued today were printed and made in response to what was expected to be the casualty totals that the Americans were going to see when we invaded Japan. And of course, 2 nuclear weapons changed that outcome forever.
Looking at the US forces tilt to the Indo-Pacific region, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but the focus is on dispersed positions and island defence. What lessons can you draw on from history to inform what the Corps is doing today?
I'm a huge believer in history, especially military history. And the reason why I believe in it is because it offers lessons across the generation. As military, guys, we tend to be enamored by the Romans, lessons they offered us, and the Napoleonic staff system, which is still with us today. But more recently, specifically in the Indo-Pacific, I find there's 2 main storylines in history that offer many lessons to the Marine Corps. And one is the British Expeditionary Force experience in Singapore, counting on the British Royal Navy to come to the aid of the Expeditionary Force. Famously, that didn't happen. And because that didn't happen, the evacuation never could occur, and reinforcements didn't show up. And ultimately, you had a British Expeditionary Force of the Commonwealth surrender to I won't say a nearly defeated, but I'll give credit to where credit's due, is that the Imperial Japanese forces were kind of depleted. And they were an inferior force to the British Expeditionary Force that was kind of defending Singapore. Because of the key pivotal moments that occurred in General Sling's kind of disaster there.
Was it Percival? General Percival at Singapore?
Yeah, Percival. What you had was a situation where the Imperial Japanese struck the water purification plant, and then at that point, it was just a matter of days before the British were forced to surrender, and the Royal Navy never showed up. So there was 2 key things that could have changed the outcome. Plus, the Japanese were already running low on ammunition, running low on food. There were extended supply lines, and had the Royal Navy showed up, they could have easily interdicted and disrupted that supply chain that was coming down the Malay Peninsula. It really shows that an aggressive attack can really be devastating to a defense. And, there's countless lessons here, and that is, something we look at. I think there's a second storyline, and also from the British experience. And the Americans also have an experience there with the Battle of Corregidor and the surrender of the Philippines and the evacuation of General MacArthur, and what later becomes the Bataan Death March. There are many lessons there just for the Americans, but there are different lessons that I think we look at from a sea power perspective. And that is really what the Indo-Pacific is a sea power fight. It's a maritime fight really focused on sea power. What you can do on the high seas as a seafaring nation that the United States is, and as a great power, that is where America can really change the security environment. I would offer to you that we know this because the British Royal Navy for generations defined what was to be kind of the Pax Britannica as England and the Royal Navy shapes global power for what is kind of a couple hundred years. There's a kind of pivotal point in this island called Menorca off the coast of Spain in the Balearic Island chain. It's kind of a great stand-in for what is Taiwan to the kind of global security community. 3 times, England directs the Royal Navy to seize and defend and hold this island known as Menorca. And it's thousands of miles away from England. And it's this island that is off the coast of a great powers, both in France and Spain. And it's kind of a great stand-in for what is kind of China and Taiwan, thousands of miles away. People don't have a very good understanding of why Menorca is important. But what's interesting is that when you ask the average British, or at the time English, they couldn't even find Menorca on a map. But merchants and the parliament and the government all knew Menorca. And the reason why is because it sat critically at the mouth, not at the mouth like Gibraltar, but just past the mouth. And it offered the world's largest inland harbor. So it was critical to merchant trade that England as an island nation depended on. And there's very many similarities here for the United States, where Taiwan sits in the South China Sea, is a pivotal place along a key security corridor which trillions of dollars of merchant traffic maneuver through. Although most Americans can't find Taiwan on the map, like Menorca, the government, our Congress, all find Taiwan, just like the Parliament, found Menorca extremely important. And that's why the British, over the period from the 1600s to the 1800s, fought for control of Menorca 3 different times. Oddly enough, all 3 times the British lost control of Menorca and were able to regain control of Menorca.
It's interesting you talk about Singapore as an example of how the Japanese army worked, and as you alluded, it was a foraging army and didn't really have a robust supply chain and relying more on what they could forage, steal, or even capture on the march. And eventually Slim at Kohima and Imphal was able to use this against him, but I know you're keen to get your Corps more involved in forward provisioning and foraging. Can you explain how you see this working and what it is exactly?
I appreciate you bringing that up. And I'm a fan because it really boils down to a math equation. And the reality is that General Smith has made it clear, or Commodore, many times, and he's posed this question in open forums. Why would I'm quoting him here, why would I water the United States to a position deep on the first island chain? Why would I do that over thousands of miles and levels? Gallon of water costs 100 times more because you're moving the water. Make it. We have water purification capability. You can buy it locally. As you pull that logic thread further and further out, very quickly it becomes clear that if we're able to make water or buy water, can we buy fuel? Can we, in the local markets and farms and grocery stores? Really, the answer, it really boils down to it depends. And I really kind of pull a lesson here from Alexander the Great, as he's doing this great campaign across the Eurasian continent. Alexander makes a kind of critical decision early on in his campaign. Instead of his supply chain reaching all the way back to Greece, he preserves only certain, messages and finances and other critical kind of high-value trips make it back to Greece. But everything else, for the most part, over Alexander's great campaign over the Eurasian continent, comes locally. And he's able to feed and maneuver his army over thousands of miles over many years, far from his supply chains. And is able to do that because he attacks during, he allows the weather to dictate, when he attacks. He allows the logistics to drive the operations because it's so important. And during both the Afghan and Iraq wars, we, and I say with the Brits, everyone else that was involved in the coalition of willing, we were able to turn total expanses of desert into big supply bases and big bases, and we could feed thousands of people in the middle of nowhere. Hell, we could deliver ice cream into a blazing hot desert with 30 different flavors. The reality is that we were facing an adversary, couldn't interdict any of that, couldn't shape that, yet we still lost. Now we face a situation with a peer adversary in many ways who could certainly change the outcome of a decisive engagement. So gone is the 30 flavors of ice cream. Gone are the big stores and shops that America brings to war with it. Those comforts that we have, those creature comforts. But we focus on survivability of the force. And what that really boils down to is, can you procure those things locally in order to preserve your force, sustain your force? When you start pulling from Alexander's lessons here, maybe you go to an island, maybe you have a series of choices with particular islands you can go to. Maybe island A has got incredible resources on it. Island B is, kind of a little thinner resource. And maybe island C has almost no resources. And although island C may be the greatest tactical advantage, you as a commander have to make a hard decision here and ascertain whether or not it's worth bringing in the logistics to sustain yourself on island C, when instead maybe it doesn't provide all the greatest tactical advantages to you, but it does reduce the logistics burden on your forces. Island A, you take, or maybe it's Island B. And ultimately, Island C may come into play when the security conditions are in your favor. But at the early onset of conflict, you're going to be strapped to move all that you want and need. And at the end of the day, you have to boil it down to what you need. Well, when I'm doing the math equation, which is effectively logistics, when I do that stubby pencil work and we're writing out all the math here, we very quickly realize that for us to go to war with the sufficient resources we need in the typical kind of context, the math does not favor us. If we start forging kind of 21st century forging, not the version of Alexander the Great, then the math starts to balance out, especially at the platoon and company level. Now, I'm under no illusions that we're going to try to forge for a battalion or regiments or anything beyond that. But that's not in our game plan with the MORs either. In kind of wide-ranging public documents, it talks effectively about the kind of small, dispersed teams able to operate effectively on these kind of remote positions. That's why I think forging has got its place.
I want to move the conversation on a bit now to Ukraine. The Ukrainians haven't made the progress that everybody was hoping they would, and they've been held up by massive minefields and defences in depth that have only advanced about 15 k's. They've taken heavy casualties, estimates of 70,000 killed in action and 100 to 120,000 wounded in action, with the Russians approximately 300,000. Replacements are in many cases much older, and it was reported in the papers recently that they had to slash the medical criteria. Traditionally, massive fires and persistent operations favour the larger army, especially one with a bigger population, and this is a war that suits Russia. When you look round, the West is distracted by Israel, and Congress is in turmoil, and Trump possibly inbound. It's not looking good for Zelensky. Sanctions haven't crippled the Russian economy, and the defence industry is keeping pace better than the West, with production of artillery rounds much higher. When you look at what Putin's spending on defence next year, it's going to be 3 times what it was in 2021 and double that of 2022. And they're spending roughly $27 billion on domestic security, i.e. the police, armed forces, National Guard and intelligence agencies and prisons, which is 40% of the budget. Oil exports to China are now at a record level, and oil sales to India are the same, and some of that oil that's going to India has been refined and sold back to the West, so that keeps the money flowing into his coffers. Downside for Russians, the Kremlin slashed healthcare and science, but funded propaganda via state-controlled media to the tune of $1 billion, so he keeps people on side with his messaging. And Richard Conley of the Royal United Service Institute says that this budget represents wholesale militarisation of Russian society, and also it's about getting the war sorted in Ukraine and about being ready for a military confrontation with the West in perpetuity. So what lessons should we be taking from Ukraine, and what wrong lessons, probably more importantly, are we in danger of learning?
That's a fantastic question, because it's something we wrestle with. And let me start off by saying the war is not over. So we certainly run the risk, Colin, of taking a snapshot now and saying, okay, these are the lessons. Well, the war isn't over, so we don't know whether or not if these lessons are truly, lessons yet. They just may be kind of, we're like trying to catch a falling knife here. We're going to get cut by it. But there are themes, no doubt, that I think are critically important. And these themes are stuff that anyone who's in the security space is definitely watching. And I'll throw out some that I think are invaluable. I will tell you, early on in the war, it was drones, like the quadcopter and the DJI drones were what amazing kind of capability. But Colin, here's what's really incredible about the drones, is that it's transition. It's not just drones, it's the FPV drones, the first-person view drones. Because the Russians have countered with their own tactics, techniques, and procedures to counter those kind of DJI drones. But now the Ukrainians have countered with FPV drones, which are smaller, can move very fast, and are almost damn near undetectable because of how low they fly. So FPV drones are really turning into the mix of, it's like almost a perfect mix of danger, speed, lethality, fear. It can be detected or almost indetectable until too late. So when it comes to drones, it's really like FPV drones are disposable, rapidly purchasable, easy to operate, and then kind of give the operator, because they're first-person view, an unbelievable advantage at understanding the terrain and, of course, prosecuting the attack. So FPV drones, I think right now is like the theme that I'm pulling from. The next one I'm pulling from is just how fragile air defenses are. I think regardless if you're the Russians or the Ukrainians, and air defense or lack thereof can really break entire regions under which you're fighting.
It's not really been an air war as such, has it?
That's right. It's really been a missile war, especially when it comes from air defense perspective. And the irony is not lost that you've got drones, which are like a 21st century, 2020s kind of technological advancement. And then you have these integrated air defenses that is effectively forcing the return of the World War I kind of trench warfare, which is kind of unbelievable because you're effectively fighting with modern weaponry and you're getting the same result as what we saw in World War I. You're returning to trench warfare because you have to go down into the earth in order to have some degree of protection. I would offer to you that because of the air defense, there's no really good overhead fires you can prosecute from a fixed wing or rotor wing platform. And so because of that, your fixed wing fires are further away from the forward line of troops, and they're effectively they're ineffective. And then what you're resorting to is a shoot and scoot artillery and indirect fire kind of situation. And artillery is back, I think, in a unique way, especially when it comes to the war in Ukraine. Ultimately, I think the biggest thing that comes away beyond all the technological advancements is the fact that nothing can suffice for good soldiering skills, basic soldiering skills. And what we may have seen, and I don't have, these are only my assertions here, but I suspect that the Russians and the Ukrainians lost all of its kind of highly effective troops that didn't adapt well, that were effective during various peace situations. What it has now is kind of the survivors, those that kind of made it somehow, either because they were lucky or because they were able to adapt faster than the weapon systems targeting them were.
There was a saying in Vietnam that if you could survive the first month, you had a good chance of surviving a year-long tour of duty, so it doesn't really seem that much changed. And we've discussed previously on the pod the lack of good basic skills that you sometimes see on both sides, and that's from personal camouflage and concealment, the use of cam nets and track discipline. These are basically the building blocks of soldiering, and you neglect them at your peril. Another concern I've got is that is the West really prepared for a long war like the Russians seem to be doing? I fear that Putin's digging in for the long term, both politically and on the ground. And you get the impression he's hoping the West will lose interest. And with the possible change of a president next year in the US, it may well make a difference to what he's expecting his outcome in Ukraine to be. Also, when you look at sanctions, they haven't really crippled the Russian economy. So I just wonder what you think about that.
That's a fair question. And I'll be, honest with you. I just don't know. But I do know that we've been here before. We've been in this situation before where we've not been as prepared. I give you a great example. During the run-up to World War II, America was doing all that it could, politically and domestically, to stay out of the war in Europe. Famously, President Roosevelt was very kind of at keeping the war at arm's length, being careful to respect the neutrality agreements, although trying to help the British. We famously had this Lend-Lease program where we would give to Canada ships and aircraft, and the British would have to come over and pick it up. And there was all these legal workarounds the United States was trying to come up with in order to stay neutral, because domestically the Americans did not want to go to war. A lot of that has to do with the experience for World War I and the significant casualties the United States faced, although that pales in comparison to the casualties that the British and the French experienced. However, it just did not resonate as in, here's another war across the pond that America is being called to fight. But what was interesting is that because of the British demand signal, the American economic and war machine was able to get a warm start. We're already producing aircraft. We're already producing munitions and ships to send over to the UK. And famously, we're sending over pilots as well, like the British American volunteer pilots from going to China. The AVP flyers, the Flying Tigers, that's where they were known, prior to the United States entering World War II. And in England, American volunteer pilots were going over and becoming Canadians and becoming British citizens to fight. In a way, we got lucky in the United States by having this warm start. And I would offer to you, Colin, there's something very similar is happening now, where because of the war in Ukraine and the difficult and challenging security environment in the Indo-Pacific, the United States has also got its warm start. I just read the other day that U.S. artillery production is at an all-time high in like decades. And it's because we've been able to turn on the factories and there's a demand signal from them. Famously, the United States maintains the Arizona Aircraft Boneyard, which is thousands of aircraft that we have decommissioned that can be brought back online. And we have, although our naval sea power is kind of in a weakened state, we have more aircraft carriers than all the nations combined. Our naval air forces alone are larger than most of the nation's air forces combined, just from the Navy. Although we may not be on a war footing, and I would offer to you that it's our intention. There's a bit of that is kind of the reason, but that is a feature, not a bug of the American security system, is that we don't want to go to a war footing. And because a war footing means, I won't say a catastrophic, but it means a kind of a very challenging domestic situation. It would kind of signal to our adversaries is that the only option is war here. And I would offer to you that there is some security preservation efforts that goes on by not going into that war footing. Or right now, the Russians, because they are in a war footing, you cannot get any more out of that economy. There just is not going to be more production out of that. Famously, the Russians, I just read the other day, have not sold a single piece of war material during the Dubai air show. No one's buying Russian. Their stuff is not good. We're seeing it kind of catastrophically high order explode on the battlefield. I don't know anyone that wants to buy a Russian tank these days, given what we're seeing. So there is a kind of cost to going to war footing. Although you're able to produce armament, I think in the case of the Russian economy, it's on a high-speed rail to disaster. There is a criticality when an economy is on a war footing, that it will just eventually exhaust itself. And given that the Russian economy is on a war footing now, I think it's just a matter of time. And that is, of course, easier said than anything else. But given that the Russian economy is on this war footing, it will eventually consume its most kind of capable aspect and transition to and start cutting away more and more of its capability of the Russian economy. And the fact is that from the United States perspective, of course, we want to be cloaked by the kind of industrial might of the United States and be able to produce this high technology, highly capable tools of warfare. But the reality is that if we can avoid going on to a war footing as an economy, that's a great thing. The United States economy, as I understand, in the last few quarters has done pretty well. All the while, we've been supporting Ukraine, and we've been transitioning in the Indo-Pacific to show the area that the United States intends on staying and not shrink from its obligations and responsibilities as a global superpower. We've been able to do both, kind of relatively low cost to the domestic economy and to U.S. resources, military resources.
Yeah, NATO countries in Europe haven't invested properly in their armed forces for decades now. And you have the examples of Poland, where it's pouring huge amounts of money into its defence over the next 5 years. And at the other end of the scale, you have Germany, who, according to a recent report, will be ready for long-term combat operations for another 15 years. And the UK is no innocent here. Our forces have been hollowed out for years now. So defence is a real big concern in Europe.
If I was a European soldier, whether I was in the German army or the Swedish army or an Englishman sitting in the British army, I would be concerned. As NATO countries, we have differing attitudes towards what is, a good standing military. And what the reality that has been built in the NATO kind of structure is, though, although the countries are now investing, it just takes generations to invest into a strong and capable military. And it just takes a long time to turn that ship around. And it takes continued, consistent investment. I know that NATO has had a minimum standard of investment into its military. Other than Poland, no NATO country has met its legal obligations for military investment. I really think that it boils down to your capability. I'll be honest with you, I'm very impressed that the Royal Navy was able to build 2 aircraft carriers, although it has one in kind of a mothball, semi-decommissioned state. The reality is that the return of the Royal Navy is a good thing. The return of the Royal Navy into the high seas and its ability to project power and secure the global economy alongside its partners is a good thing. There's nothing wrong with a strong Royal Navy. As a matter of fact, the United Kingdom enjoyed a strong Royal Navy for generations.
Yeah, the problem with these Elizabeth-class carriers is that the Royal Navy, a bit like the US Navy, is having huge problems with recruitment at the minute, which is affecting the ability to meet commitments. There's also issues with affordability of aircraft carriers and adequate carrier escort vessels. So whether or not it's an enduring capability is up for debate.
That's all true. In the United States, the Navy is experiencing recruiting issues as well, and experiencing kind of famously issues with its ships that it's bought. It's having decommissioned relatively new ships just because they're not exactly what we need to engage with the peer adversary. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the United States has made mistakes with its investments in its military. It's famously underinvested and overinvested, in my opinion. But I think the NATO countries are starting to kind of wake up to the reality that the war in Ukraine is not ending soon. We're always hopeful for the kind of new fighting season to be the change maker. But as we're learning, this Ukraine war, the Ukrainians are not going to give up. And for all intents and purposes, they just need to outlast the Russian will. And that is the question here, is how long can the Russian people hold out against Putin's tyrannical dictatorship and his kind of insane effort to seize wide swaths of Ukraine? How long can the Ukrainians hold out, and how long can the Russian people put up with it?
Yeah, as we discussed earlier, Putin is playing the long game here, I think. And he's pinning his hopes on a change in US leadership and hoping to bleed out Ukrainians on the battle space.
I think that's a fair assessment. War is an extension of politics. If I was a individual that was in the kind of inner circle of Putin, I would be very, very concerned. Because every day that war in Ukraine goes on without resolution to the favor of the Russians is another day that Putin's demise can occur.
Another area I want to discuss is what's happening over in Israel and Gaza, where it looks like Israel has suffered a catastrophic intelligence failure, and the IDF have been caught out by a smaller force using innovative tactics like hang gliders. And you can see how they're also copying tactics, techniques and procedures from Ukraine, i.e. the use of cheap drones to drop ordnance. So I was just wondering what your thoughts and what you're seeing in the fighting there.
Support to Israel is obviously in America's interest. And America has a long history of support to Israel. And both of our militaries, the IDF and the U.S. military, have had a long, good relationship that has contributed to each other's defense. Famously, the Russian or the Israeli defense forces rely heavily on U.S. military aid. The good news is that the Israeli defense forces is a kind of a truly national identity military, in the sense that every Israeli serves. And so what they built is this kind of identity through the military, and it's been able to kind of unify what is effectively multiple disparate cultures and people of different origins that have come to Israel because they're Jewish. Israel has a very powerful military, but even then, like on 9/11 and October 7th, as tragic as it is Israel's 9/11. And the reality, I think, that the Israelis will do a postmortem on what happened, what took place, what were the information and intelligence gaps, what were the mistakes and assertions that were made. Just this morning, the New York Times has released an article saying that there are indications that the Israelis knew of an attack, didn't have a date, but something similar to the scope and scale that took place on 7th October. I would tell you, kind of hindsight is always 20/20. It's always easy to look back at the many thousands and millions of streams of data and trying to kind of sift through and make these predictive analysis. But ultimately, at the end of the day, Israel is a unique democracy in the region. Continued support to Israel is something that's in America's interest. I think that the president made this very clear. I think ultimately that Israel will have to do an internal look at the kind of what went wrong here and make hard changes to its national security architecture and the way it makes decisions based on intelligence reporting.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see the lessons learned from fighting in that very dense, heavily populated urban environment with a huge, complex tunnel system. We've not really heard much about it at the minute, as most of the attention is on the fires being directed against Hamas, who are sheltering in buildings amongst the population.
Yeah, definitely if you're following a lot of the Israeli accounts on Telegram, I think we're seeing just how brutal that urban warfare is. But also, Hamas as a terror organization is fighting an asymmetric war, obviously by taking prisoners. And it's a kind of great example of that. It doesn't wear uniforms, operates on the fringes of society, uses human shields and what is traditionally protected buildings such as mosques, schools, hospitals. And so you can certainly get emotional about all of that. But the reality is you're facing a terror group who will kind of break all the rules of warfare. But continuing U.S. support and assistance will kind of keep the Israelis and anyone else that's involved from its worst tendencies, which naturally war tends to bring out.
Your Colonist Marine Instagram account is going from strength to strength, and I see you have a variety of conversations across the rank structures with colleagues, with subjects as varied as availability of uniform to issues with Taiwan and China. What's your ambition for the account, and what sort of impact do you think it's having?
That's a great question, Cole. I got to be honest with you. Well, one of the things I would appreciate, especially with you, was that the account has been able to give me access to people and thoughts that, and you have, very kind of unique positions on things that ultimately is very similar to the United States, but also different. And I'm eager to learn from guys like you and others. The account, the Cognitive Brain, has been able to give me access to all of these people on kind of a level playing field that otherwise would have been impossible. But to answer your question about what is the end state here, I think one day management of the account will be impossible for me. And sometimes like I feel that those days are sooner rather than later. But ultimately, I feel at some point in the near future, I think there's a real possibility I'm going to hand the account over to someone else. I don't know who, I don't know why, I don't know when. But by keeping my face and kind of other aspects of the account out of it makes this easier. I think that some of the people listening or who will see this eventually on Instagram, I think they may say, oh, there's no way. But the reality is that if you were to sit in my shoes and see the stream of and thought, the very provocative and very kind of nuanced and well thought positions that people have, I think you would kind of come to realize that, man, I am like surrounded by some really intelligent people that reach out to me often and frequently have better, more nuanced, more detailed responses to many of the issues that I bring up than even I could have imagined. So I think what use of Instagram and through the Cognitive Brain has been able to do for me is kind of shape my perceptions about what I know and certainly what I don't know. And I really learn from a lot of the people often. Guys like you, Colin, are great teachers of kind of and reveal to me in kind of unvarnished, unquestioned terms as to the depths of the things I don't. And it certainly has humbled me and really shaped the way I approach my job, because I'm more keenly aware now because I talk to literally thousands of people every week from all walks of life with all different various degrees of expertise, that just how little I truly know about kind of the subjects that I'm engaged on. To answer your question, it's been great.
Yeah, used well, I think it's a fantastic tool, but also conversely, used badly, it's awful, because I don't know if you saw, there was a Twitter post by either a US Army officer or a US Marine Corps officer. Yeah. About the Mustang promotions, if I'm hoping. I don't know. Basically, he's complaining about soldiers being promoted from the ranks, infecting the pool of commissioned officers.
Yeah.
Wade does like a bucket full set, got Martin and stuff down.
Yeah. So no doubt, social media, as you well know, if you are on the wrong side of an issue, may God be with you.
I thought it was a parody account at one point.
My gut instinct tells me whoever wrote that did so like it's a real person, but did so to kind of troll. There's no way someone in this modern era thinks that they're going to say something like that and it's not going to like erupt. But it got everybody's attention. And, I'm impressed, across the pond, you're tracking it. You got the same details I do. Yeah. What's remarkable is that the British military's got a lot of prior enlisted officers in its ranks.
Yeah, they tend to have one in each subunit, and the competition's got a bit harder from what I gather, but the route is easier for people to make the jump, if that makes sense. But moving on, I recently listened to a podcast with Jim Webb, a decorated former Marine officer who won a Navy Cross, Silver Star, Bronze Star and Purple Heart in Vietnam, and he's the author of 8 books, including Fields of Fire, which in my opinion is one of the best novels about the war in Vietnam. He's a high achiever and serves as Senator, Secretary of the Navy and Assistant Secretary of Defence for Reserve Affairs. On this podcast, he discussed Colonel Pete Ellis, a US Marine Corps intelligence officer whose life reads like a film script. He wrote Ops Plan 712, Advanced Base Operations in Micronesia, that formed the basis for the US campaign of amphibious assault against Japan in World War II. I'd never heard of him before, but is he well known in the Marines, and is there anybody like him today?
He certainly is well known among certain groups of Marines. I think if you were to ask your average Marine, they would know who Pete Ellis is. They would recognize the name, but they would have no context about who or what he did. I think amongst those that are in the know and understand what he did and how he died and his contributions to the Marine Corps, I think there is kind of a unanimous position within the Marine Corps that Pete Ellis was well ahead of its time. Was so much so that you almost need a Pete Ellis, a guy who is willing to kind of put it all on the line. And what's interesting about Pete Ellis is that he died, and dies, under suspicious circumstances. And many assume, I think rightfully so, that he was murdered by the Japanese. But Pete Ellis had some skeletons in the closet. He drank too much. He was an imperfect guy. And that's one of the reasons why I like him, is because he's not a perfect Marine by any stretch of the imagination. But what's really impressive about Pete Ellis, and I think that we, whether you're in the Marine Corps or any service, needs to pull away, is that Pete Ellis truly believed in what he believed in, and that he was willing to put it all on the line to kind of validate his position. And that alone is worth more to me. Some people get enamored with promotions, position, command or not command, or whatever your contribution is to the military you serve or the role you serve in. But at the end of the day, all of us want to have some kind of contribution that we truly believe in and that we all are willing to put it on the line for. And, ultimately, none of us want to die for, everything, every kind of wild idea each one of us have, but we certainly want to put it on the line. And I take a few pages from Pete Ellis. I'll admit that at times I try to emulate him when it comes to things that I believe in, like an origin, and our responsibility as leaders to kind of prepare our units to what is to come. I think we should be putting it on the line like Pete Ellis. And if we believe in it, write about it. Does it, stake your claim on it. Be proud of the fact that you believe what you believe in. Don't shrink from it. And I think if we do all of that, then not only do we kind of embody Pete Ellis, but we allow the lesson that Pete Ellis gave his life for to continue on within what it is to be a Marine.
It's interesting you use that phrase, what it is to be a Marine. I saw a social media post recently put up by a US Marine, and on it he said, you can join up for self-improvement and to get qualifications, but at the end of the day, the Marines is about closing with and killing the enemy. I paraphrase, but you get my drift. I understand what he meant, but a modern fighting force offer has to be one that potential recruits want to take up. So what are your thoughts about balancing that offer and meeting the realities of being a Marine, which for a lot of people will involve closing with and killing an enemy?
It's a fair question, and it's something that the U.S. Army is struggling and the U.S. Navy is struggling with, and that is how to bridge the service gap between those who have come to enjoy the freedoms that have been hard-earned, that paid for in blood. How do I, as a Marine officer, convince the average Joe that it's worth joining the Marine? I think by conversations like we're having right now, eventually we'll reach the ear of civilian, whether he's some British bloke, chomping on fish and chips in some train station and listening to this podcast as he's transiting the tube, or some dude riding a bus going home from high school in some small town in Iowa. And everyone in between is going to listen to this podcast. And I hope that they hear some common themes, and that is, not only does joining the military, but the Marine Corps offer you opportunities unlike any other, but it also gives you an opportunity to be someone, the best version of yourself, and be that person. I think a lot of people kind of tend to daydream, postulate what it is to be the best version of yourself. Some people are enamored with money or fame, or whatever it may be, but ultimately to be respected by your peers, to go into harm's way, to come back and kind of share these war stories and kind of positions and beliefs, to have served with such great people, that is the value.
Yeah, and those aren't necessarily tangible skills. They don't feature on a paycheck at the end of the month. They aren't on a certificate you get for doing a course. And the quandary is, how do you get that across to the people that you're trying to recruit and in your adverts?
I'll give credit to where credit is due. The British Royal Marines have got some incredible adverts.
Oh, they're repeat.
It's like,
us.
Yeah, it is like, holy cow, sign me up. Yeah, and then it just kind of really evoked the inherent masculinity or the power of service, what that means to a young man or to a young woman, and that regardless of your sexual orientation or your religious beliefs or even your political beliefs, that service within a kind of core group, whether you're aircraft mechanic, cook, or infantryman, you can carve out your own world, your own respectable world in that kind of organization. And that's something that I wish I could deliver to more people. I go back and I tell you that I do talk to thousands of people practically every week. I engage with many tens of thousands per month. There are some common themes in there, and that people tend to gravitate to these kind of core positions, and that I just kind of reiterated there. I think if you just share that, it's like it has an attraction all its own. And, it's as old as time. People are enamored with kind of the hard life, or the difficult life, and the earned life, the well-earned life. And it's really phenomenal.
That's a great phrase, that, a well-earned life. We're going to wrap up now. So what book are you reading at the minute, and what are you going to recommend to the listeners?
So right now, I'm reading a book called 2034, and it's about the future of warfare. And it was written by a famous Navy Admiral who recently was the commander of Indo-PACOM about a decade ago. 2034 really kind of paints a picture of what the reality of warfare would look like in 2034. AI, machine learning, rapid targeting, and how fast technology can change the battlefield. But on the same vein, 2034 calls out some very basics of training and readiness, like good unit leadership, also make the day. If you read 2034, I think you take kind of your slice out of it, whatever kind of organization you kind of grow up at, and your angles, you could certainly pull your own storyline out of that book. And for me, I do the same here. But the storyline I pull out of 2034 is that that nothing can suffice with nothing, very little can beat a well-trained. And at the end of the day, I think that's what matters.
Well, we're going to finish now, so it's been great to catch up again. And I looked up Okinawa just before recording this episode. And I didn't realise what a nice place it was with great beaches. It's a bit of a holiday destination.
Yeah, Colin, I'll make this invitation publicly to you, man. You're welcome to come out and stay.
Yeah, no, that's really appreciated. And I mentioned that to my wife the other day there, but I got in the bit about the beaches being a paradise first and the battlefield tours second.
Yeah, absolutely. You propagandist of my own clock here.
That's it for another episode. Thanks to our guests for coming on the podcast and to you, the listener, for your continued support and suggestions. Please keep them coming, and our email and social media links are at the bottom of the show notes as normal. You can find us on all the usual suspects, including Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. And if you download us from iTunes and like the podcast, it'd be great if you leave us a review there or anywhere you get your podcast from. And thanks again to Nick Beale for his continuing help and support for his company ISARR. And we'll see you next time on The Unconventional Soldier.